It's dawn on the Chaldiran plain. Across the field, Ottoman soldiers are chaining wagons into a wall. Cannons point through the gaps. Thousands of men wait behind them with loaded muskets. On Shah Ismail's side, there are no cannons, no muskets, only cavalry carrying swords, bows and lances. And here's the crazy part. Ismail wasn't ignorant. His army had used guns before and won. He knew exactly what cannons could do to men and horses caught out in the open. And still, his cavalry begins to move. So why would a king who already knew better ride straight at cannons without a single gun of his own? This is the summer of 1514, and the man riding toward those cannons is 27 years old. 13 years earlier, Ismail had walked into the city of Tabriz as a 14-year-old and declared himself ruler of a brand new empire. His followers didn't just see a king. Many of them believed he was something close to a living saint, chosen by God, impossible to defeat. He'd spent a decade proving them right, one victory at a time. The man behind the wagons is Sultan Selim of the Ottomans, and he didn't march this far to negotiate. Before he even left his own capital, he had already turned against people inside his own empire who shared Ismail's faith, rounding up anyone he suspected might rise up behind him while he was away fighting. This was bigger than a border dispute. Selim and Ismail were fighting over territory, religious loyalty, and which empire would dominate the region between Anatolia and Iran, and neither man believed there was room for the other. Before marching, Selim had religious scholars back home formally declare this a holy war against a fellow Muslim ruler, something that rarely happened at this scale. By the time the two armies reached Chaldiran, Ismail did have one real advantage. His nearly 40,000 Qizilbash were rested, well-fed, and fighting close to home. Selim's men, roughly 60,000 of them, had marched for months through land the Safavids had deliberately stripped bare, and they arrived exhausted, hungry, and on edge. But Selim still had more men, and more importantly, he had the one weapon that could make every other advantage disappear. And you wouldn't believe where Ismail was when the fighting started. He was hunting quail. While Ottoman cannon fire was already hitting his own vanguard, the king they were dying for was somewhere behind them, chasing birds. The night before, he'd been drinking with his commanders until sunrise. That's how certain Ismail was that this battle already belonged to him. And here's what changes the whole story. This wasn't the first time gunpowder had touched Ismail's life. His own father had used cannon to take a fortress years before Ismail ever took the throne. Ismail's own soldiers had fought with artillery in his early campaigns, and, at least once, muskets. And they had won. So this wasn't ignorance. Ismail knew exactly what these weapons could do, which only makes the next question harder. Why did he show up at Chaldiran without a single one? His army was built around riders called the Qizilbash, the redheads, named for the 12-folded crimson cap every one of them wore into battle. They didn't follow Ismail for pay, they followed him on faith. That question alone is worth sitting with, and if you're not subscribed yet, this is exactly the kind of story we dig into every week here. Back to the plain, because we're about to see how costly that missing weapon becomes. Selim's army had spent months building something the Qizilbash had never faced in the open field before. Hundreds of supply wagons chained together into a solid wall stretching across the plain. Cannon barrels pushed through gaps in that wall, angled outward. Behind them, thousands of Janissary soldiers stood with muskets already loaded. Altogether, close to 200 cannon and another 100 mortars aimed at open ground. On Ismail's side of the field, zero. None of this worked by accident. The wagons weren't just cover, they were a system. Carts to stop a charge, cannon to break it, musketeers to finish what the cannon started, each part covering the next. Cavalry doesn't beat a system like that through courage alone, no matter how fast the horses are. The Qizilbash were about to learn that the hard way. When the battle opened, the Ottoman guns fired first, and the noise sent Safavid horses into a panic before the two sides ever closed. On paper, this should have been over in minutes, but Ismail didn't send his cavalry straight into that wall of cannon. He aimed for the flank, where the gun line was thinner. For a few minutes, it worked. His riders broke into the Ottoman flank, killed the commander holding that wing, and pushed deep into the formation. For those few minutes, riders who'd grown up believing steel and courage beat anything watched their charge actually work. Then the guns found them. Cannon and musket fire tore into cavalry, packed too tightly to turn or scatter. Horses went down, riders crashed into each other in the chaos. There was no cover on that plain, and once the charge lost its speed, courage couldn't restart it. This is the moment the battle turned, not simply because the Ottomans had more men. Once Ismail's cavalry got trapped out in the open, Selim's cannon and muskets became decisive, and Ismail had nothing that could answer them. Ismail didn't immediately pull back. He rode into the fighting himself, still trying to break the Ottoman flank as his men fell around him. Cut down by musket fire, they had no way to answer back. At some point in that chaos, Ismail was wounded and his horse went down under him. For a few minutes, the man his followers believed nothing could kill came within reach of being captured by the same army whose guns he had no answer for. And this is where the answer finally comes into focus. Ismail's army was never just a group of soldiers. It was built around the Qizilbash, cavalrymen who tied honor, faith, and loyalty to fighting on horseback with a sword in hand. To them, crouching behind a wagon and firing from a distance didn't look like progress. It looked like cowardice. And Ismail's entire power rested on those men. Changing how they fought meant challenging the identity that had carried him from a 14-year-old boy to the ruler of an empire. Pride mattered. Confidence mattered. Getting enough guns in time may have mattered too. There probably wasn't one single reason, but the result was simple. Ismail understood the new kind of war and led an army built for the old one anyway. But Ismail hadn't lost everything, not yet. He escaped with roughly 300 riders still around him. Thousands of other Safavid soldiers survived or scattered in different directions, but as an organized army, the force that had ridden into Chaldiran was finished. 2 of Ismail's wives did not escape with him. Ottoman soldiers captured them during the pursuit, and Selim, who rarely missed a chance to humiliate a rival, married one of them off to one of his own officials instead of sending her home. 3 weeks later, Ottoman troops walked into Tabriz, the city where a 14-year-old Ismail had once declared himself a living legend. They looted the capital and delivered exactly the humiliation Selim wanted. Then something happened that Selim hadn't planned for. Within about a week, worsening supply lines and the approaching winter pushed him out of the city, and soon after, his own army mutinied against pushing any further into Persia. Ismail didn't lose his empire that year. He lost something harder to rebuild, the belief that he couldn't be defeated. And that brings us back to the real question, not who won the battle, what Ismail actually lost. Ismail lived another 10 years after Chaldiran. He never led an army into battle again. Sources describe him withdrawing almost entirely from running his own government, spending the rest of his reign away from the throne room and the battlefield alike. The invincible king his followers had built their faith around simply stopped showing up. The border Chaldiran opened didn't get finalized that day. It took 2 more treaties, one in 1555 and another in 1639, over the next 125 years to lock the line between the Ottomans and the Safavids into something close to permanent. That was the trap Ismail built for himself. The cavalry that had made him an empire had become too important to change. The same identity that made his men fearless also made adapting feel like surrender. He was the king who had already used guns and won, and he still rode to Chaldiran without one. He avoided the cost of changing. He paid for it anyway. That's the Battle of Chaldiran, 500 years later, still drawn into the map of the Middle East. I'm Zombo. If you made it this far, you're already part of the quest. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.